Okay, looks good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhuta Guhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarva Vide Namaha. Very good. Welcome to you all. Welcome also to our many students attending these classes online. We continue our study of, is it my ears? You hear okay, right? Okay, must be my ears. We continue our study of Upadesha Sahasri with the penultimate chapter, which is arguably the most important chapter of the entire text, and without doubt it's the longest of the chapters. It's over 230 verses long. We're going to abbreviate it somewhat in today's class in our study of this chapter. It's called Tattvam-asi Prakarana. Prakarana means chapter. So it's a chapter on Tattvam-asi. Tattvam-asi is the entire teaching of Advaita Vedanta, meaning, or suggesting, I should say, that nothing is left out from this chapter. With regard to its length, over the years, a great number of people have complained to me, Swamiji, why is Advaita Vedanta so complicated? And some of the texts, in fact this text, got into many fairly detailed, technical, and complicated discussions. And why is that so? And it's interesting to observe the irony, interesting irony. The complexity of a subject matter should be this complexity of a teaching should be related to the complexity of the subject matter. Simple subject matter, simple teaching. Complicated subject matter, complicated teaching. So our subject matter in Advaita Vedanta is nirguna. What does that mean? No details, no complication. The subject matter is the simplest imaginable subject matter, one absolute reality, having no features or details whatsoever. So arguably it should be the simplest thing to teach, and in fact it is. Why are there so many complicated teachings found in the body that we call Advaita Vedanta? And the reason is not because of the subject matter, which is infinitely simple, if we can use that expression. What is not infinitely simple is our minds, and in particular, our ignorance. Our ignorance is tremendously complicated in the sense that we have made so many wrong conclusions about what is real, what is not real, about who we are. When you conclude that I am a human being, that's a wrong conclusion. How many wrong conclusions have you made over the years? You have to admit that the complexity of our ignorance is staggering. And let me illustrate that in a little bit more personal way. When I was studying during our 3-year course with Pujya Swamiji in the 1990s, at one point I got particularly frustrated over this particular point. And in particular, my particular frustration was because my mind would keep creating more and more arguments. I would just look for something wrong, something to argue with, and I kept looking for what could possibly be wrong, and my mind kept creating these arguments, these objections, one after another, and frankly, I found it very irritating. My mind, the nature of my mind. And I remember praying that, oh God, please give me a mind that's simple. Because if my mind were simple, it wouldn't constantly be creating all these doubts and objections, and therefore I could just rest in the truth of these teachings without all this mental noise going on. Of course, that's not a very well-reasoned prayer. God has given us what we have. We have powerful minds, all of us. And these powerful minds are capable of very deep, complex thoughts and capable of finding many possible objections to these teachings. Whatever is said, it's possible to object based on some kind of reasoning. So, to sum up this part of the introduction, to handle the complexity of our minds, the complexity of ignorance, the ability of our minds to find little chinks, as it were, in these teachings, to create objections, to handle all of that, we need some extremely sophisticated teachings. So the complexity of the teachings is not due to the complexity of the subject matter at all. It's due to the complexity of our minds. So we have a teaching that is more than adequate for all of our complexity, and that is something to be very, very grateful for. One of the things, in fact, if there's any central theme in this chapter 18, the central theme is that chapter 18 addresses objections again and again and again. In fact, the subtle structure of the chapter is to raise an objection and to negate it. Raise another objection and negate it. Now, the objections may not be literally raised, but the commentator is very quick to point out that here Shankara is replying to this possible objection. Or here, the commentator will say Shankaracharya is replying to another possible objection. The commentator will make that very clear. So here we have the longest chapter, arguably the most complex chapter, which is certainly capable of dealing with the complexity of our mind. So with that introduction, we can begin. And because it's such a long and important chapter, it begins with a prayer verse. We've always recited the very first verse of the text, which we began our class with. Actually, after Sahana Vavatu, we recited this verse, Chaitanyam Sarvagam, which is a prayer verse for the very first chapter, and therefore, generally, when a text begins with a prayer, that prayer is considered to apply to the entire text, not just the first chapter. But because chapter 18 is so important, it has its own prayer verse, which we'll see now. Yenatmana viliyanta, yenatmana viliyanta, udbhavanti cha vrittayaha, udbhavanti cha vrittayaha, Nityavagataye tasmai, Nityavagataye tasmai, Namodhi pratyayatmane, Namodhi atmane. Namaha, last verse, Namaha, salutations, Dhi pratyaya atmane. Atmane means unto. Atma. When a compound word, this is a compound word, Dhi pratyaya atmane, when a compound word ends in atma, the word atma usually doesn't mean sat-chit-ananda. So according to syntax, they call it, we have to interpret that word properly. In this case, it means one whose self, one whose nature. So to get the proper interpretation here, Namaha, salutations, Atmane, unto that whose nature is Dhi Pratyaya, that which is the true nature of Dhi Pratyaya. Dhi, buddhi, mind in general. Pratyaya is one of our many words for thoughts, vrittis, mental activities. So Dhi Pratyaya refers to all the activities of your mind. And you will recall from our prior classes that every activity of your mind has as its underlying reality consciousness. We said the simplest way to understand what is a thought is consciousness with name and form. How simple is that? You complain about not you as an individual, but people say, oh, it's so complicated. That's not complicated. A thought is consciousness. And a thought means any mental activity. It could be an emotion. It could be a perception. It could be any kind of activity occurring in your mind. So all of those mental activities have consciousness as their content and some name and form, some attribute that represents what it is. So if we're talking about the emotion of sadness, what is the emotion of sadness? Consciousness plus the form of sadness. Don't ask me what is that form. This is an analysis of thoughts. So from an analytical point of view, the feeling of sadness is consciousness. When consciousness attains a form, a particular form, it's perceived as sadness. Just like when clay achieves a particular form, we call it a pot. So clay in this particular form is pot, and consciousness in a particular form is sadness, or happiness, or pain, or looking at the beautiful sunrise, or thinking about what you're going to do tomorrow. Whatever it is, those are all forms of consciousness. So, Namaha, salutations Dhi Pratyaya Atmane, to the Atma of Dhi Pratyaya. The Atma of mental activities, the essence of all mental activities, consciousness. Of course, Shankara is such a genius. He uses these expressions very intentionally. He could have just said salutations unto consciousness, but he's teaching us through this prayer verse. Every time you encounter a prayer verse in any text, you can be sure that it's not just a prayer. You can be sure that it's also teaching you something. So here, teaching us what? That the content of every mental activity, let me rephrase it. The content of all experience is consciousness. I'll say that again. All you experience is what happens in your mind. Do you experience anything else other than what happens in your mind? Remembering that whatever you see around you ends up in your mind. So the only thing you experience is what's happening in your mind at the given moment. And the content of that experience is consciousness, atma. So Shankara begins, Namaha, salutations unto that consciousness which is the content of all experience. Now go up to the top. Yena atmana viliyante. The A drops due to grammar rules. Unto that consciousness, yena atmana, because of which, yena atmana, because of which, second line end, vrittayaha, mental events, thoughts, experiences, because of which all experiences, udbhavanti, arise, and viliyante, fade away. So very simple but beautiful and profound. Salutations unto the consciousness, which is the content of all experience. Up at the top, yena atmana, by which, that consciousness because of which, vrittayaha, all experiences, udbhavanti, rise, and viliyante, fade away. So salutations now in the third line, tasmai, unto that consciousness which is nitya avagataye, which has nitya avagati, to undo the grammar here. Nitya avagati, my translation here doesn't really capture it well, unchanging. Nitya avagati, avagata is that which is present. So that which is present in this pot, avagata, that which is present in this pot is clay. But here the term used is nitya avagati, eternally present. The consciousness, the consciousness from which your thoughts arise, the consciousness into which your thoughts return, the consciousness which is nitya avagati, which is eternally present. Eternally present means before you were born, after your body dies, in deep sleep, in any possible condition, that consciousness is. And that consciousness, as we've discussed before, is a fundamental reality. Unlike this world of names and forms, which is transient, everything in the world comes and the world itself comes and goes, what to say. So everything comes and goes except for this fundamental reality that we call consciousness. So Shankara says, salutations unto that consciousness, that divinity. Notice he's not, in some text, Shankara will have a prayer verse directed to a deity. Govinda is one that he uses, others as well. Notice it's not a particular deity that Shankara worships here, but rather the essence of all deities is this consciousness. This consciousness is the fundamental reality because of which you and I exist. This consciousness is a fundamental reality because of which Krishna, Vishnu, Shiva, all the deities exist. Now, you might wonder, sometimes people wonder, here, Shankara is let me put it into the form of a question. Swamiji, if Shankara is worshipping here consciousness because it's a more fundamental reality than, say, Shiva and Vishnu, then why though is Shankara one step down from the absolute reality? One step down? Can you figure out how it is that this is one step down? He's talking about consciousness which is manifest. manifest in the form of thoughts, manifest in the form of experience, the content of your experience. So somebody might say, why doesn't Shankara just worship attribute-free consciousness? Consciousness which is unmanifest, consciousness which is identical to Nirguna Brahman. So why doesn't Shankara worship in this verse the consciousness which is identical to Nirguna Brahman? He actually comes down a step to a lower reality, a reality in which it's not pure Brahman, but Brahman manifest in the world. In this case, Brahman manifest. Remember, Brahman and consciousness are synonyms here. You know that one, the least quoted Mahavakya, Prajnanam Brahma. Prajnanam means consciousness. That consciousness is a fundamental reality. That fundamental reality is Brahman. So then you can ask, why doesn't Shankara worship here that pure, absolute reality? Why does he worship instead a manifest reality? Saguna Brahman is a term often used. And there's a very good reason for it. At the level of Nirguna Brahman, worship becomes impossible. Think about it. At the level of Nirguna Brahman, there's no worshipper, there's no worshipped. There is only Nirguna Brahman, nothing else whatsoever. There is no such thing as worship of Nirguna Brahman. It is, what is the term? Oxymoron. Meaning that the very expression is self-contradictory. When you say worship, you imply worshipper and worshipped. But when we're speaking of Nirguna Brahman, there's no worshipper or worshipped. There's only Nirguna Brahman. So Shankara, for this reason, doesn't go to that highest perspective of Nirguna Brahman, but stays in the realm of prayer. Prayer is valid at the level of the world. Okay. Then, having concluded this prayer verse, we continue with the first verse of the text. And again, I'll remind you, this is abbreviated. You notice that the prayer verse was verse 1. We've skipped verse 2. We'll continue with verse 3. When I started editing, I've been taking roughly 50% of the verses. I don't know if that will increase or decrease as we go through the chapter, but so far we will see roughly half of the verses. And by the way, these verses, I have to say, one of the most tedious, not in a negative sense, but a very demanding activity is to choose which verses to get rid of. It's easy to choose verses to keep. Really difficult. It's like if you have, this is a bad example, if you have 6 children, which will you get rid of? Which will you get rid of? You know, there's a reluctance. So anyway, so far I've gotten rid of half. Anyway, bad joke. Let's continue. Nitya mukta sadevasmi, nitya mukta sadevasmi, tyevam chetna bhaven matihi, tyevam chetna bhaven matihi, kimartam shravayatyevam, kimartam shravayatyevam, matravachutirādrata, matravachutirādrata. Nitya muktaha sat eva asmi. Asmi. I am. Sat eva. Sat here meaning that absolute reality, Brahman. So here's sat. And sat is used many times in the opening of this verse in the sense of Brahman. Sat, absolute reality, Brahman. So Sadeva Asmi, I am that Brahman. Nitya Muktaha, I am eternally free. I am Brahman, I am eternally free, pointing to one of the most important teachings of Advaita Vedanta, and that is, you do not, in your true nature, you do not become Brahman. You don't become divine. In common language, we say your true nature is divine. It's not that you become divine. You are, in essence, that divinity. So here, Shankara is saying, you are, in essence, Brahman. You don't become Brahman. You are Brahman, leading to this very peculiar question, then what does it mean to, quote, become liberated? And this is a topic we've discussed many times in this text and in other situations as well. To become liberated, to answer that question, what does it mean to become liberated, we have to first ask, who are we talking about? Who's becoming liberated? Because your essence as Brahman can't become liberated. It is Nitya Mukta. So Brahman doesn't become liberated. You, in your essential nature, do not and cannot become liberated because you already are that Brahman. But then we use this expression, to become liberated, to gain enlightenment. Who becomes liberated? Who gains enlightenment? This one, the individual person with a body and mind, the individual person with ignorance. And basically, enlightenment, as the word suggests, is to get rid of that ignorance. So if you are ignorant of your true nature as Brahman, then you're in a state of bondage. When that particular ignorance is removed, and you know, Sadeva Aham Asmi, I am Brahman, then did Brahman become liberated? There was liberation, but that liberation took place due to the removal of ignorance. This is not only fundamental to Vedanta, it's also not understood by many. And it's a huge stumbling block. If you don't get this, you don't get anything else that follows. It's like what is the expression? You start off on the wrong foot. So if you start off on the wrong foot, saying, Swamiji, what do I have to, what will make my Atma liberated? That's starting off on the wrong foot. So Shankara makes it very clear, your true nature already is Brahman, but that true nature remains unrecognized, being covered by a so-called veil of ignorance. When that so-called veil of ignorance is removed, you discover what? Nitya Muktaha Sadeva Asmi Iti Evam. Iti puts it in quotation marks. So you make this discovery how? By means of the Mahavakya. The first topic in this chapter. Not surprisingly, if the chapter is called Tattvamasi, what do you think the first topic of the chapter will be? Is actually the Mahavakya Tattvamasi. So this is what, through the Mahavakya, you remove that veil of ignorance, you discover your true nature to be already Brahman. So, he says, Evam chet na bhavet matihi. He says, chet, suppose. Suppose, evam matihi, this kind of understanding, na bhavet. And by the way, I know it says bhavein, but I'm breaking these sandhis. I'm separating the words. I'm undoing grammatical changes so that you can hear the words independently. So, na bhavet. Suppose this understanding does not arise. Suppose tattvamasi, you hear tattvamasi, and we'll make I don't know if this is a joke. You hear tattvamasi. How does tattvamasi affect your essential nature? Not at all. Your essential nature was Brahman before you heard tattvamasi. It is Brahman after you hear tattvamasi. But what about you, the individual? You hear tattvamasi. Tell me, how many times have you heard tattvamasi? Thousands? Which one of those thousands made you liberated? Uh-oh. So that makes us wonder, well, wait a minute. How can 3 little words make you liberated? To remove ignorance, to remove this particular ignorance, is no simple task. We've said before, ignorance is complex. Because of the complexity of that ignorance, these 3 words have the power, but only when you are ready, when you're prepared, when you are an adhikari, when you are fully prepared for these teachings, then those 3 words will operate and remove that ignorance, not in the meanwhile. So suppose you have a doubt, though. I've heard tattvamasi so many times. I've attended so many of Swami Taratmananda's classes, and I've done this and all this meditation, and I'm still... So it may lead you to doubt. Doubt whether or not these 3, quote, magic words, as it were, can these 3 magic words really make you liberated? Well, Shankara says here, if these 3 little words couldn't make you liberated, then kimartam, then for what reason, shravayati evam matravat shutihi. We have to find the subject of the sentence, which is shutihi, buried in that last word. Shuti becomes shruti due to more grammatical rules. Shruti means scripture. So kimartam, why? Shruti, scripture. Why would scripture shravayati, teach evam, teach this again and again and again? And why would the scripture which is last word, adrita, so respected? Why would the scripture, which is so highly respected, continually teach tattvamasi matravat? Nice, like a mother. Like a mother lovingly takes care of her. Does the mother just feed the child once? No, continually. So does the scripture just say tattvamasi once? In fact, in the Chandogya Upanishad, where it comes, I think it's 9 times. Tattvamasi, shweta-keto, I think, if I remember right, 7 times, 9 times. Anyway, so again and again and again and again. So like a mother, scripture says again and again, tattvamasi, tattvamasi, tattvamasi. Why repeatedly? Well, you've heard it 1,000 times. Has it worked so far? So, meaning a few more times are necessary until you are fully prepared. That's the obstacle right now. The obstacle is not the scripture. The obstacle is here. The obstacle, you get it, very thick skull. And the scripture has to penetrate that thick skull and go through. Now, to understand this statement a little bit better, it's helpful to get inside Shankara's head, so to speak. In ancient times, Shruti, scriptures, the last word, adrata, were so highly respected. Nowadays, not so much so, but in ancient times, so much respected. And that's why Shankara says, like a mother. Shruti, the word Shruti is feminine in gender, so scripture is often compared to a loving mother. Just like a loving mother feeds you again and again and again, scriptures teach you again and again and again, spiritual nourishment, as it were. But to really understand that ancient worldview, it would be helpful to look at a counterexample, modern worldview. Think of how much respect we have for science. We have tremendous respect for science. I think that's usually true. I mean, if it weren't for science, I don't think any of us would be sitting here, because our life expectancy would be about 30-something. Due to science, we have this longevity. We have healthy bodies and strong minds due to science. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you don't have so much respect for science, what's wrong with you? I mean, we're sitting here because of science. Anyway, so presuming that you do have so much respect for science, that feeling that you have towards science is the feeling that the ancients had towards the scripture. Our very existence is due to science. In ancient times, they saw scripture in that same light. They saw scripture as a source of everything. And the reason I'm making this point is to help you understand Shankara's feeling here. He's expressing an emotion. He's talking about his mother, after all. So like a mother cares for you. So science has given us long lives, healthy lives. So in this way, the scripture has nourished Shankara and all the ancients. Now, in modern times, we don't give scripture the same respect that we give to science. And I'm not criticizing, I'm not saying we should. In fact, not too long ago, there was so much blind faith in scripture, it caused problems, absolutely caused problems. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing that we've shifted our perspective from blind faith in scripture, as in ancient times, to acceptance of scientific truths. That's a good thing. But then, does the baby go out with the bathwater? Does it mean that scripture is no longer relevant? So there's another argument. This is not Shankara's argument is who doesn't love their mother? What an argument. Shankara is saying that scripture is like your mother, and of course we all love mother anyway. So this is Shankara's argument, which worked at his time and place. It may not work so well today, but an alternate argument for the validity of the scripture is this. Shankara's leading question is, suppose it didn't work. Suppose Tattvamasi didn't work. It hasn't worked for 1,000 times, so why should it work in another 1,000 times? Well, tell me, if it never worked for anyone at any time, do you think these scriptures would have survived through all these generations? That doesn't make sense. The fact is, Tattvamasi might not have worked for you yet, notice, yet, but for so many others, it has worked. And those enlightened ones are the ones who have, through generation after generation, they have taught Tattvamasi, Tattvamasi, Tattvamasi. So we can shift our perspective from mother scripture to this parampara, this lineage of enlightened teachers who have maintained these teachings through the generations. The argument is very simple. If these teachings were not effective, how would they possibly have survived for 2,500 years? It's pretty obvious. Okay. So, continuing with the Mahavakya. We'll see how far we get today. Siddhadevahamityasmad Siddhadevahamityasmad Yushmadharmo nishidyate Yushmadharmo nishidyate Rajvamivahidhir yuktya Rajvamihahidhir yuktya Tattvam hityadi shasanaihi Tattvam hityadi shasanaihi. Start at the end. Tattvam iti, referring to the Mahavakya, Tattvamasi. Tattvamasi iti adi shasanaihi. Shasana, teaching. Through these scriptural teachings, like Tattvamasi, people have gotten enlightened. Maybe you are yet to be enlightened, but as we just said, if no one ever got enlightened through these teachings certainly would not have survived to the current day. So we can say, then how did it work for them? If it hasn't worked for you so far, how did it work for them? How is it supposed to work? In fact, here's the commentator talks about this in several places. The commentator says, how can these three words deliver aparoksha jnanam, direct, immediate knowledge? Generally, words only give paroksha jnanam, indirect knowledge. When words describe something, suppose words describe a mountain, say Mount Everest or some mountain. So those words convey to you an indirect knowledge of the mountain. If you want to directly experience it, you have to go there. So the argument comes, I don't want to spend a lot of time, but since the commentator brought it up, let me just share that point with you. It's easy to doubt the capacity of words to reveal an immediate reality, an absolute reality, an ultimate reality. Generally, in the general use of words does not seem to support that. We in fact, Taittiriya Upanishad is famous for saying that yato vacho nivartante aprapya manasa saha, that absolute reality is that from which words fall back, along with the mind, having failed to grasp that reality. The Upanishad itself admits the limitations of words to grasp that highest reality, and here we are using words. Not only that, we're just using these three itty-bitty words. Sorry for being a little weird here. So these three itty-bitty words, sat-chit-ananda, they're not even big, profound words. So these three tiny little words, how can they possibly reveal an ultimate reality? And that's what Shankara wants to explain in this verse. And the sneak preview, as it were, what do they call it? Spoiler. The spoiler is these words don't grasp. These words don't need to grasp. How did this text begin? You already are that. These words don't need to grasp the highest reality. These words, however, do need to remove ignorance. Words cannot grasp an absolute reality. Words, however, most certainly can remove ignorance, even the most complex ignorance. Maybe we need lots more words for that complex ignorance. This is why we got 230 verses in this chapter. But the words have the capacity to remove ignorance. And he explains how here. Suppose in the second line, Rajvam Eva Ahi Dihi Yuktya. Suppose it's about rope snake, by the way. The word Raju is rope and Ahi is snake. They're kind of hidden here. Raju and Ahi is snake. So Ahi Dihi, the thought of a snake. You all know the metaphor very well. Suppose you're walking down that dark alley and you see. Now tell me, do you, and think twice before you say anything, do you see a rope or do you see a snake? And this is trickier than you think. What do your eyes pick up? Your eyes pick up whatever's there. What is there happens to be a rope, right? You conclude it's a snake, but that's not what your eyes see. Yeah, of course it's dark, so you can't really see it very clearly, but your eyes picked up a rope. That is ahi dihi, the perception of a rope. So, you've already seen the rope. Then what's the problem? Why are you trembling in fear in that alleyway? It's because that perception of a rope is, where am I here? Here. That perception of a rope, yuktya, because it is associated, rajvam eva, it is eva. It is apparently associated with a snake. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I turned this around. I have to apologize here. What I've just spoken was completely incorrect. Completely incorrect. That's not what Shankara is saying here. So let me, and I, what did they say? Bad on me, because I didn't look at this line carefully enough. And I do prepare for these classes. I didn't look at this line carefully enough. This ahi-dihi, this perception of a snake. So please, whatever I said for the last 5 minutes, press the rewind button, the erase button, just ignore it. Because it's absolutely not what Shankara is teaching here. So, my mistake. So, ahi-dihi, this perception, this false perception. Ahi-dihi, dihi means a thought. Because when you see, you say, I see a snake. That is ahi-dihi. I see a snake. It's a wrong conclusion about a perception. I see a snake. But that wrong conclusion is yuktya. It is due to the yuktya. Turn this in. My translation is right. I'm trying to see how the Sanskrit says that. Rajvam Eva. The grammar looks a little bit odd here, which is, I think I cheated on the translation here. I don't want to bore you with a lot of grammatical analysis here. Something looks off in the grammar. I'm not sure why I'm not seeing it properly, but Shankara's meaning is obvious, it's very clear, and that is, You see, you imagine the snake. You see a rope and imagine a snake. So I'm cheating right now. I can't see exactly how the Sanskrit says this. I don't, something in the grammar I'm not seeing properly. I'll look at it another time perhaps. So, but Shankara's meaning is clear. You see a snake where there's only a rope. What's going on? So, and seeing the snake makes you suffer. What do you have to do? Well, I want to go back to what I said before was wrong in the sense that it didn't follow the Sanskrit, but the meaning was right. So when I said what I said was wrong, is there's something wrong in my interpretation of the Sanskrit. Nothing wrong in the meaning I'm conveying to you. So let's set the Sanskrit aside and just get the meaning right. And the meaning is this. Your eyes actually see rope. You superimpose snake on that rope. That rope is harmless. That snake makes you suffer. So suppose I tell you, hey, if I tell you that it's just a rope, how does that free you from suffering? You're already seeing a rope. If I say it's just a rope, does the snake get converted into a rope? That's really important, right? The snake doesn't get converted into a rope. There never was a snake in the first place. The problem is ignorance. When that ignorance is removed, there's no problem. There's just a rope. So this is how this example works. I don't know how the Sanskrit works, but I certainly know how this metaphor works. And this metaphor now, Shankara applies to the Mahavakya Tattvam Asi. Now it turns out that Tattvam Asi, even though the words assert a truth, the words reveal the meaning through negation. And I'll just give you a little backstory here. There are actually texts on Tattvamasi. In fact, Shankara is famous for a text called Vakya Vritti and a shorter version called Laghu Vakya Vritti. Vakya means Mahavakya, and not any of the Mahavakyas, but specifically Tattvamasi. So there are entire texts written just on these three words. And you say, wait a minute, just three words, how can it be so complicated? Again, is your ignorance so simple that three words would work for you? Or is your ignorance more complicated than three words? So, turns out that the words tat and tvam reveal their meaning through a process of negation. And we're at the end of the class now, so I can't go. Maybe next class we might do this in detail. Instead of explaining that in detail, let me just bring you to Shankara's explanation. There is a process of negation implied in the Mahavakya, Tattvamasi. Tat reveals its nature through negation. Tvam reveals its nature through negation. We don't have time to discuss how that takes place, but Shankara's explanation here is very simple and clear. How does this Tattvamasi work? Through negation. Notice, you get rid of the snake, you get rid of fear of the snake through negation. It's not... Yeah. I really have to go through this. I think we'll do that at the beginning of the next class. Let's finish this first, though. He says, Shankara says, how does it work? He says, Siddhat eva aham iti asmat, asmat siddhat, from that which is siddha, established in your experience. Asmat siddhat, asmat siddhat, from that which is present in your experience. What is present in your experience? Aham iti, I. So right now, present in your experience is I. Aham iti. And Shankara says, asmat siddhat, from that I, which is present in your experience, yushma dharmaha nishadyate. We have to talk about this next week. I'll explain it here, though. Yushma dharma, this is a reference to his Brahma Sutra Bhashya introduction. This very profound, elaborate teaching. Yushma dharma, aham and yushmat. I and not I. I and you. I and this. Or simply I and not I. To paraphrase this line, Shankara says, for the aham, the I, that's present in your experience right now, remove what is not I. He is giving you the key. Of course, what does that mean? Right now, I is present in your experience. Remove from this experience anything that is not I. Well, what do you mean by not I? Anything that you can refer to as yushmat, you or that. So let's stay with the pronoun, or this. We'll use the pronoun this. So if we can start by, how about this chair? So since chair, is chair a this or an I? By the way, Shankara obviously loves grammar. You can see that. And we'll return to this in the beginning of the next class. He uses grammatical analysis sometimes to teach. So let's just do this. Differentiate between I and this. Anything that is a this is not I. This chair. So since chair is a this, I can't say I. I can't say I am a chair because chair is not an I, chair is a this. You can see where this is going. This body. Body is a this. Just like chair is a this, can't be an I. Body is a this, can't be I. This body, this prana, the life that's present in the body, this vitality, or depending on how you're doing today, this tiredness, could also be. So whatever, it's still a this. So being a this, it can't be an I. So body is not I. Your prana is not I. How about these sense faculties, sight, hearing, smell, etc.? This capacity for sight, it's a this and not an I. And now we wrap this up. This thought, this feeling, this perception, this experience. Experience is a this or an I. Everything you're experiencing right now is this. And Shankara says, nishadyate. Anything that's this is to be negated. When all that is this is negated, what's left is I minus all this wrongly superimposed thisness. Body, mind, etc. all gets superimposed on I. And that's what Shankara is saying. Shankara is saying here that Mahavakya works through this process of negation. When you remove all that is this from I, what remains? Let me just go back to that last statement. We'll conclude. This experience. When all that is experienced is removed, what remains is the consciousness by which all that is experience is known. The consciousness that reveals whatever is being experienced. That consciousness is the truth of aham. Aham, in essence, is pure consciousness. We have to come back to this next week. We'll do so. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet, asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om tat sat.